When we talk about the human mind, one of the most unsettling truths is that your brain is not a neutral observer of reality. It is an active storyteller. It constantly interprets, edits, and simplifies the world around you, not because it wants to deceive you, but because it is designed to keep you alive and efficient. Every second, your brain is bombarded with far more information than it could ever process consciously. To cope, it takes shortcuts, filtering details, filling in gaps, and making rapid assumptions. What you experience as reality is often a carefully constructed version that feels complete, even when it isn't entirely accurate. This is why two people can witness the same event and walk away with completely different memories of it. Memory, despite how confidently we trust it, is not a recording. It's a reconstruction. Each time you recall an experience, your brain subtly rewrites it, influenced by your emotions, beliefs, and expectations in the present moment. Over time, memories can shift without you ever noticing. The unsettling part isn't that memory fails, it's that it fails while feeling absolutely certain. Confidence, in this sense, is not proof of accuracy. It's often the result of a well-rehearsed illusion. The brain also relies heavily on patterns and predictions. It prefers speed over precision, especially in social situations. This is why first impressions form almost instantly and feel so convincing. Within seconds of meeting someone, your brain decides whether they seem trustworthy, competent, or threatening. Logic hasn't weighed in yet, but the judgment already feels settled. Later, reasoning often steps in not to question that judgment, but to defend it. We don't just see the world, we see what our brain expects to see. These mental shortcuts are incredibly useful. They allow you to navigate complex environments without being overwhelmed. But they come at a cost. When unchecked, they create blind spots. They shape biases, reinforce stereotypes, and keep us locked into familiar ways of thinking. The brain's goal is not truth, it's efficiency. And efficiency can quietly harden into limitation. What makes this insight powerful is not the idea that your brain tricks you, but the realization that awareness changes the game. The moment you understand that your thoughts are interpretations rather than facts, you gain distance from them. You become less reactive, more curious. You start questioning assumptions instead of obeying them automatically. This doesn't mean distrusting your mind, it means engaging with it more intelligently. When you slow down a judgment, examine a memory, or pause before reacting, you interrupt the brain's autopilot, and in that pause, something important happens. Choice returns. You move from being driven by unconscious processes to participating in them consciously. That shift doesn't just change how you think, it changes how you live. We often like to imagine ourselves as rational thinkers, carefully weighing evidence before making decisions. It's a comforting image. But psychology tells a different story, one that's far more humbling. In reality, emotion is usually first on the scene. Before logic has time to analyze, the emotional centers of the brain have already reacted. By the time you think you're reasoning, a decision has often already been made, guided by how something feels rather than what it objectively is. This isn't a flaw in human design, it's an evolutionary feature. Emotions evolved to help us act quickly in uncertain situations. Fear pushes us away from danger. Desire pulls us toward opportunity, and anger mobilizes us to protect boundaries. These emotional responses happen in fractions of a second, long before conscious thought enters the picture. Logic, slower and more deliberate, arrives afterward. Its role is not always to challenge the decision, but to explain it, to create a story that makes the choice feel reasonable and justified. This dynamic shows up everywhere. In arguments, people rarely change their minds because of better facts. They change when they feel understood or safe enough to reconsider. In consumer behavior, people don't buy products because of specifications. They buy because the product makes them feel confident, attractive, or secure. Even in moral reasoning, studies show that people often have an intuitive emotional reaction first and then build a logical framework around it to defend their stance. Reason becomes the lawyer, not the judge. The danger here isn't emotion itself, it's unexamined emotion. When we're unaware of how feelings guide us, we confuse emotional certainty with objective truth. A strong emotional reaction can feel like clarity, even when it's actually bias. This is why people can hold contradictory beliefs with confidence, or double down on decisions that clearly aren't working. Logic, when recruited only as a defense mechanism, becomes a tool for self-deception rather than understanding. But this relationship between emotion and logic doesn't have to work against us. When you recognize that emotions are signals rather than commands, you can begin to work with them instead of being controlled by them. Emotions carry information. They tell you what matters, what feels threatened, what feels meaningful. Logic's role is not to silence emotion, but to interpret it wisely. The problem isn't that emotions exist, it's that we often let them drive without supervision. This awareness changes how you listen, how you decide, and how you relate to others. You become more patient with disagreement, more curious about your own reactions, and more deliberate in your choices. Instead of asking, "Is this logical?" you start by asking, "Why does this feel so strong?" That question alone can interrupt impulsive decisions and open the door to deeper understanding. One of the most profound discoveries in modern psychology is that the brain is not a fixed machine. It is a living system that constantly reshapes itself. For a long time, we believed personality, intelligence, and even emotional tendencies were largely set in stone after childhood. That belief was comforting in a way. It relieved us of responsibility. But neuroscience tells a more demanding and ultimately more empowering story. Your brain is continuously changing in response to how you think, what you focus on, and what you repeatedly do. This ability is known as neuroplasticity, and it operates whether you're aware of it or not. Every thought you rehearse, every habit you reinforce, strengthens certain neural pathways while others weaken from neglect. The brain follows a simple rule: what gets used gets built. This is why skills improve with practice, why routines become automatic, and why certain emotional responses feel almost instinctive over time. You're not just forming habits, you're physically shaping the structure of your mind. This cuts both ways. Positive patterns like learning, reflection, and self-regulation create stronger circuits for focus and resilience. But the same mechanism applies to anxiety, self-criticism, and avoidance. If your mind repeatedly returns to fear or doubt, those pathways become easier to access, faster to activate. Over time, they can begin to feel like who you are, when in reality, they're simply well-worn neural roads. Identity, in this sense, is often the result of repetition mistaken for destiny. What's powerful here is not the biology itself, but the implication. Change doesn't require a dramatic transformation. It requires consistency. Small, repeated actions send a message to the brain about what matters. A few minutes of deliberate practice, a pause before reacting, a conscious shift in attention. These moments may feel insignificant, but the brain is paying attention. Over time, they accumulate. The brain adapts not to what you intend, but to what you repeatedly do. This reframes personal growth in an important way. Growth isn't about forcing yourself to be different through sheer willpower. It's about creating conditions that make different responses more likely. When you change your environment, your routines, or where you place your attention, you're not just changing behavior, you're changing the architecture that supports it. This is why lasting change often feels slow at first and then suddenly natural. At some point, effort gives way to familiarity. There's also a deeper philosophical implication here. If the mind is always being shaped, then neutrality is an illusion. Doing nothing is still doing something to your brain. Avoidance trains avoidance. Distraction trains distraction. Awareness of this fact introduces responsibility, but not blame. You are not at fault for the patterns you've inherited or absorbed. But once you recognize that your mind is adaptable, you become accountable for how you engage with it moving forward. One of the most revealing aspects of human behavior is how much we communicate without ever saying a word. Long before language evolved, the body was already signaling intention, threat, trust, and connection. That ancient system is still running in the background, quietly shaping every interaction you have. While words are deliberate and often filtered, non-verbal cues tend to move faster than conscious control, which is why they can reveal more than speech ever could. When you interact with someone, your brain is constantly reading posture, facial tension, eye contact, tone, and timing. You don't experience this as analysis, you experience it as intuition. You sense that something is off, or you feel at ease around someone without knowing exactly why. That feeling is the result of your nervous system processing patterns it has learned over a lifetime. Micro-expressions flicker across the face before they can be suppressed. A slight shift in posture signals discomfort. A pause that's just a fraction too long changes the meaning of a sentence. None of this is random, and none of it is invisible to the brain. This is why communication often breaks down when people focus only on words. You can say the right thing, but if your tone contradicts it, the listener will trust the tone. You can express agreement verbally while your body signals resistance, and the resistance is what gets registered. The brain is wired to prioritize what feels honest over what sounds correct. In this sense, language is only part of the message. The rest is carried by the body. What makes this especially important is that we're often unaware of what we ourselves are signaling. Stress tightens the body. Uncertainty changes eye contact. Defensiveness subtly closes posture. Even when we believe we're calm and composed, the body may be broadcasting tension or hesitation. Others pick up on this instinctively, even if they can't articulate it. This is why presence matters. How you show up physically and emotionally shapes how you're perceived more than the words you choose. There's also a philosophical layer to this. Nonverbal communication reminds us that understanding isn't purely intellectual, it's embodied. We don't just think our way through relationships, we feel our way through the mesm. Trust, for example, isn't built through perfect arguments. It's built through consistency between what someone says and what they signal. When those align, we feel safety. When they don't, doubt emerges, even if we can't explain why. Becoming aware of this changes how you listen. You stop hearing only statements and start noticing signals. You become more attuned to what's being expressed beneath the surface, both in others and in yourself. This awareness doesn't turn you into a mind reader, but it does make you more present, more responsive, and less likely to be misled by appearances alone. At its core, the human brain is a prediction machine. It is constantly scanning for patterns, not out of curiosity, but for survival. Patterns reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty requires energy. When the brain can predict what comes next, it relaxes. This is why familiarity feels safe, even when it isn't beneficial. Comfort isn't necessarily about pleasure, it's about knowing what to expect. And once a pattern is established, the brain becomes remarkably loyal to it. This loyalty explains why habits are so persistent. Repetition strengthens neural pathways, making familiar behaviors easier and unfamiliar ones feel effortful, even threatening. Over time, the brain begins to equate predictability with safety. This is why people often stay in routines, mindsets, or relationships that no longer serve them. The discomfort of the known feels less risky than the uncertainty of change. In psychological terms, the brain prefers a predictable problem over an unpredictable solution. What makes this particularly challenging is that the brain doesn't distinguish between healthy and unhealthy patterns. It only tracks familiarity. Stress can become familiar. Self-doubt can become familiar. Even chaos can start to feel normal if it's repeated enough. Once something becomes familiar, the nervous system adapts to it, and adaptation can be mistaken for resilience. In reality, it may simply be tolerance. The brain settles into what it knows, not what is best. This has deep implications for personal growth. Change often feels uncomfortable not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. When you attempt to break a pattern, whether it's changing a habit, setting a boundary, or thinking differently, you're asking the brain to operate without a reliable prediction. That uncertainty triggers resistance. The brain interprets it as a potential threat, even when the change is objectively positive. This resistance is not a sign of failure, it's evidence that the pattern is being challenged. Understanding this shifts how you approach change. Instead of relying solely on motivation or force, you begin to work with the brain's learning system. Small, repeated actions create new patterns that the brain can eventually trust. Consistency matters more than intensity. Each repetition tells the brain, "This is safe now." Over time, what once felt uncomfortable becomes familiar, and what once required effort becomes automatic. There's also a philosophical insight here. Freedom is not the absence of patterns, but the ability to choose which patterns you live inside. Much of what we call personality is simply a collection of repeated responses. When those responses go unexamined, they feel permanent. But when they're understood as learned, they become adjustable. Awareness creates space between impulse and action, and in that space, new patterns can form.